What is neurodiversity?
What is it about these people?
Dyslexia.
Autism spectrum.
ADHD.
Gifted.
Dysgraphia.
All brains are different.
It's okay to be who you are.
This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hey everyone, welcome to episode 77. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. Micki Boas is our guest today, and she'll be sharing about her experience advocating for her dyslexic child in a school system that often isn't prepared to support neurodivergent kids. But before we get to our interview, I want to welcome our new listeners and say we are so glad that you have found us. Our listenership is increasing daily, and we rely on all of you to help us continue to grow. A few quick favors that would help us out a ton. Leave us a rating and review on your favorite podcast platform, follow us on social media, or support us by donating through our Patreon page. You can find links to all of our social media platforms and Patreon page on our website, neurodiversitypodcast.com. Up next.
Hi, I'm Micki Boas. I'm an entrepreneur and strategist who believes in positive defiance and breaking rules and systems that don't work for us.
Stay right there.
Previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Hello, my name is Harry Thompson, and I am the author of The PDA Paradox.
What is pathological demand avoidance?
They will exhibit differences in communication, social interaction, and also restricted and repetitive behaviors and interests. PDA is best understood, according to the literature, as an anxiety-driven need to remain in control. And I tell people, try not to get too hung up on the demand avoidance aspect, because then it will make understanding how the child's presentation can differ in school more difficult to grasp.
That's episode 54. Look for it wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Today, we're chatting with Micki Boas, who wrote a book called 1 in 5, How We're Fighting for Our Dyslexic Kids in a System That's Failing Them. Before we get started, Micki, tell us a little bit about you and what you call positive defiance, and tell us what's in the book.
So while I've done this for the likes of Nike, Samsung, and other big brands, I never knew that my biggest mission of positive defiance would be taking on the education system for my two kids who learn differently. I'm a mom of two boys, 11 and 8, who both have dyslexia and ADHD. And as someone who fixes problems for a living, I wanted to see how I could fix this broken education system for my kids. And in the book, I talk about my story, 4 years, 4 lawyers, and 4 school systems to get my kids the education that they deserved. I interviewed 200 women across the country to show that this is not a Jersey City problem. This is a national crisis that we need to address. And then in the back part of the book, I talk about solutions on how we can fix it, because we don't need grandkids that are also coming against these same solutions. So thanks for having me, Emily.
I think one of the things that really resonated in your book was that you talk about just kind of some of the mixed emotions that you had when you even first realized that your son was going to need some extra support, and whether or not that would mean that he would have something official on his record. Can you talk just a little bit about your thoughts and feelings you had in those early days of recognizing that he learned differently?
Yes, I hear you talk a lot about this on your show, so I'm glad you asked that question. I was in denial despite so many things that were obvious. For example, my mom is a speech therapist. My husband is dyslexic and saw the early signs. And I think the societal pressures that we have as parents to have our children have this certain standard and be neurotypical is what allowed me to be in denial for so long. And because of the typical ranges that our pediatricians love to tell us about, but despite the fact that the average pediatrician visit is 10 minutes, so how are they going to really understand the depths of my children's learning abilities? And so that's what kept me in denial. And I write about in the book that staying in denial kept the bubble around me, and I wasn't quite ready mentally or physically to take on what was ahead of me. But it wasn't until he was called the Statue of Liberty in class that I realized this was a major problem that I had to take on, and there was no choices, and I just mustered the strength to fight the system. And so
you want to think that the system's going to work, and you want to think that your kid's going to be just fine. It's interesting. I think, when I work with my clients, I'm a mental health counselor, but I came from the field of education. And so I kind of pull from a lot of those places. And I know that there are so many parents who are so afraid of being labeled that parent. They don't want to be the one who is, rocking the boat or making people upset, or they're afraid that their child will be retaliated against in the school. But ultimately, as parents, we have that obligation to our children, and also really, I think maybe even in a broader sense, societally. How did you get to the point where you felt comfortable in that role of being that parent, that disruptor in the school system?
So I was okay with that role of being the disruptor when I realized that staying quiet was not going to get my child the results that he needed. Staying quiet is what our society teaches you so that you don't become that parent. But it actually wasn't until 20% of the population has a learning disability. So that is 1 in 5 people on your street. And it wasn't until I started having those open and honest conversations that I realized that I was going to have to be the disruptor. And I love this term that my publisher came up with, but I found so much support online and in the Facebook groups and all of these places. I found more information there than I ever did in a doctor's office. And so the disruptors really live in those groups, and I accurately named them the Dyslexia Fight Club. I even made a t-shirt around it because we have to own it when we have to go in there. And all of these SPAN groups and these special education groups, they are playing too soft of a narrative to really get the attention to change the system. So that's what I'm good at in my professional life, is causing a fuss. And so I tried to do that here. And that's the only way that change happens, if we use our voices collectively.
There are so many kids who fall through the cracks. One of the things when we talk about kids who have learning disabilities, learning differences, need more support, we wait for them to fail before we even offer that. And it's interesting, you mentioned like the pediatricians and those developmental milestones. And it's you're right. It's like they kind of take this wait and see approach, when really we need to be much more proactive.
Mm-hmm. There's 3 points that I make in the book, and you just hit on one of the biggest ones. But I really talk about this trickle-down effect from underfunding to early intervention to teacher training. I think those are the 3 systemic issues that we're facing as we try to educate dyslexic kids, right? And so at early intervention, you can accurately diagnose a dyslexic child, as you know, at 5. The typical reader should be reading by 7, but yet we diagnose 2/3 of dyslexia at age 10 when it's almost too late to remediate. I mean, Nadine Gabb is doing some of the most fantastic work on early intervention, and we just don't screen in kindergarten and do the things that we need to do because the funding isn't there. And so, especially in this world of COVID that we're living in, it's free and appropriate public education. It is your right. And so I'm really scared about what's going to happen and as we start to deal with the effects of this pandemic. But if we're not getting them screened, we don't have a shot. And so I would encourage every parent listening to your podcast to ask for that evaluation now, because it took me 18 months to get the support I needed for my little guy the second time around. So imagine if you are a newbie to this, it's such an intimidating thing. And all it is a 3-sentence email. I would like my child to be evaluated.
What you were just talking about, especially with the pandemic, I think is really important. I was just talking to a parent yesterday, actually, who started the referral process for their child last February, right before the pandemic, and then everything got pushed off, and then now they're in this position, and it's a year later, and they still really don't have anything in place. And all of a sudden, again, they're really seeing the struggles that are taking place and losing all of this time. And I think that's such an important piece. Do you feel like for your sons, with all of the work that you've done, have you caught up on the time that you felt like you lost initially?
In terms of catching up, I think we're all facing this COVID slide, which is very similar to the summer slide, but has gone on much longer than a summer. And so the system in general was already struggling. So, for example, my district in Jersey City was $155 million underfunded. So they don't have enough money to open up the school. So how are we going to catch up, to your point? And I've seen some innovative solutions that people have been talking about. I'm not sure if you saw the piece from Robert Slavin on the tutor marshalling plan, but he proposed an open letter to Biden to hire 300,000 tutors to close the gap. I'm seeing people submitting private bills. So potentially your practice can fill in there, where they're submitting them to the district because there's just not enough people to close that gap. And so I've been lucky enough that my older son is in a private school and they've been on technology and have trained teachers. And so they are able to scale that, right? My younger son, on the other hand, was put in a more compromising position, but they actually just went to a very interesting model where they stopped the day at 1 o'clock and they're providing more direct and targeted services from 1 to 3 o'clock. So I think that there's ways. It is definitely on the parents. We are definitely spending money that we do not have to find the resources that we need. And it shouldn't be that way. But I'm hoping between, downloading online, structured literacy curriculum and doing it yourself, watching YouTube videos. I mean, it's not ideal, but hopefully it gets us closer to closing that gap.
You had your mother who kind of helped you navigate that system. She helped you know to ask for the assessment, and she helped you know what language to use when you're asking for those, assessments or services, because there's almost this code switching that parents have to do to access those services. What are some of the lessons that you learned along the way in that area?
I think as mothers, we have an instinct when something is not how it should be or is not following a normal path. And I think we keep that inside of us for too long. And so what I wish I would have known and learned along the way is to have those more open and honest conversations. Like, my husband has dyslexia. I never knew it was genetic. My son isn't walking the right way and having fine motor skills. Not the right way. He's walking differently, right? And so while we see those very horribly designed posters in our pediatrician's office about early intervention, I guess I wish I would have had those conversations with my neighbors earlier to understand. And it wasn't even until we were at the very, he was 2.5 when he went into early intervention. So I didn't even know about it, even with the advantage of my mom. So imagine children, African-American children are 5 times less likely to understand and be in these programs. And so how do we get the word out to everyone? Like, why isn't this a CDC campaign? Why isn't this a national health crisis that we're talking about? Because the results are fantastic when your brain is developing to get that intervention. So I would make a call to pediatricians to have those conversations. We're not going to sue you. They're all scared of malpractice, right? We just want to have an open and honest conversation. And I think until we can find that middle ground of pediatricians feeling comfortable talking to us and parents not feeling like they're gaslit, I feel like that's when we're really going to be able to move the needle forward on early intervention.
I feel like that's also happening in the schools. I feel like teachers are afraid to make those statements too when they start seeing concerns.
So I think that this is a moment when technology becomes really empowering. So there's an app that I researched in my book called Baby Noggin. The CDC has a milestone tracker. So you can self-track, and when you bring that data to your pediatrician, data speaks volumes, right? And so data doesn't have emotions. Data is not subjective. It's quantitative results, not from a crazy mom, which they call us all the time, right? Crazy is doing something over and over again and not being heard, right? And so if you walk in with a CDC app to your 10-minute pediatricians and you say, look, he's missing all of these milestones. Oh, he's in range. He's on the developmental curve. No, I want to have an open and honest conversation. And then to your point about teachers, there was a Seek Connecticut study that showed that 65% of teachers interviewed felt that they would receive retaliation if they spoke openly and honestly to the child. And so I know for a fact in my 4 legal battles with both schools, by the way, the teachers knew what was wrong and I could see it in their eyes. There's no money to serve them, and that's why they're not speaking up. But if you approach the school that, I know there's something wrong, I want an evaluation, I will work with you. The cost of teaching 4 teachers the right way is the same cost as defending 1 lawsuit. So imagine how many teachers, 4 trained teachers versus the retaliation of not speaking up.
In your experience, you had this opportunity to work through a variety of different types of school systems, private, charter, public, Montessori was one. talk a little bit about what you learned that maybe were unexpected things that you didn't anticipate about the differences between those different settings.
You're actually the only person that's ever asked me about that in this book interview process. So cool. Thank you. I was a child and product of Montessori, and I always thought that creative learning and no boundaries was this amazing thing. And while that might work for some children, as you know, children with learning disabilities thrive on rules and regulations and patterns. And so I think that was the number one thing that kept me in denial, is that they mixed the grades and they mixed the spaces. So of course he was always within range. But the biggest shocker to me was that private schools don't get any limited support to serve children with learning disabilities. And while private schools recruit like-minded cohorts, they never consider the 20% of children who learn differently. So there's very few dollars for evaluations. There's very few dollars for support. And parents end up paying a private school tuition on top of remediation services, which to me, that was the shock of Montessori. The charter schools in our neighborhood seem to also have a progressive minded thinking, which I was interested in, but they get almost 1/3 of the funding that public schools get. And for a charter school that was supposed to be so transparent and respectful, they came up with every excuse in the book of why they couldn't give my child the services he needed. And as we talked about data, I had neuropsych reports, I had psychology reports, I had everything. But because I gave him, this is another big learning, because I gave him the help he needed, I wasn't allowing him to lock himself in the room and fall behind. I didn't win. I did not get the support that my child needed. And my lawyer messed up so bad, I had no idea that the public schools want nothing to do with the charter schools. So they wouldn't show up at my meetings. They wouldn't listen. And I didn't know what options the public schools had for me. Had I known about this earlier, I probably would have gone straight to the public schools. They have the most resources. They were super kind to me. They have structured literacy program. They have a professional development budget. And so I'm not telling parents which way they need to go. My child is in a school for kids with learning disabilities because that is the only place that teachers are trained, in my mind, for his type of learning disability. And so if I had it all to do again, I would probably just go straight to the special school that can help my child learn the right way the first time.
And it's interesting, there's so much inequity just even within those broad categories.
But listen, Emily, I talked to, this is one of my favorite interviews. I went out to Staten Island to interview Tim Costanza, who runs the first dyslexic charter school in New York City. Charter schools have flexibility and freedom, and he is training first and second graders, and he has an Orton fellow and all of these amazing things. So it can be done. You just have to have people like Tim and people like you and other people who are willing to fight the fight be on the front line. So we are definitely facing inequality when it comes to income, race, gender, evaluations, all of these types of things, but it's possible.
Mm-hmm. You know, you've mentioned a couple times OrtonGillingham. Mm-hmm. Talk a little bit about that, maybe for families who aren't familiar with what that means and how it has benefited your sons.
OrtonGillingham, I know we're not supposed to promote any system, but it's the only one I can talk about. It saved my kids' lives. If I could go back and do my career again, I would get trained in it myself. I don't have the patience for that, but basically it's a structured literacy program that uses the science of reading techniques to meet the child where they are at. And so my kids have really high skills in some areas, and so it takes those skills into consideration, and it uses the frequency that's needed to bring them up to speed. And I spoke with the Institute for Multisensory Learning, and they can get kids up to reading level in 6 weeks if it's done the right way. And it costs almost $14 a kid to bring that into the school system. So to your point, there's ways to do it, and OrtonGillingham is one of them, but any structured literacy program that's based in the science of reading is a sure fit.
There are a lot of programs that are OrtonGillingham based that people don't even realize. I know there's the Wilson Reading System and Spire are two that come to mind. it's all kind of under this umbrella of using the OrtonGillingham methodology. It is strange, though, isn't it, that we're not just doing this for all kids from the beginning?
I mean, the research shows that, you know this, I'm sure your audience does, but everybody learns great this way. And schools in Arkansas, schools in Mississippi, they've all taken on this system and the results are fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but why aren't we doing it, Emily? Why do you think we're not doing it?
Money.
Mm-hmm.
And lack of education and lack of understanding. I actually started teaching in gifted ed. That was kind of where I started my career path. It's interesting seeing, especially those kids who are very bright, who are also dyslexic and can't get those services. But there is such a huge divide between the general education classroom teachers and the special education classroom teachers and the gifted ed teachers. You know, there's not this understanding of what's going on in that's a broad statement, but you know what I'm saying. It's like, especially I think the teachers who are just in the general education classroom, they don't even always know what's going on in those special education classrooms. And that's a disservice to the students. Like, you need to be able to have that bigger understanding of what's happening, I think. And
that comes from Emily Hanford's work, which we all know, is that 4 out of 10 teacher training programs don't teach the science of reading. And so a special education teacher comes into the classroom having to know how to teach 13 different types of disabilities, right? And so whatever your thoughts are on inclusion, et cetera, to teach my kids, you need another 200 hours in the science of reading, and we don't have the professional budgets to do that. So the teachers who come out of the colleges that have the science of reading are able to kind of hit the ground running. And those who have overhauled their system, like Mississippi, they went from the bottom of the NAPE scores, up to the top. To your point, if everyone learns the best that way, why aren't we teaching all of our teachers that?
Right. Kind of shifting gears a little bit. You mentioned at the very beginning that your sons are dyslexic and also have ADHD. Mm-hmm. And originally, though, as you went through this process, you knew about the reading stuff, and then those executive functioning difficulties came up later. How did that impact what you did, how you helped your son, how you advocated at the school, how you felt about the process?
I tell my friends who have that, kind of water cooler conversation, I think there's something, my kid might be dyslexic, but he doesn't flip his B's and D's. I'm like, oh, girlfriend, hold on. It is a big picture, and there's all these things. And I was lucky enough in my evaluation that my lawyer and the neuropsych made a big point about the executive functioning, like put on your shoes, pick up your backpack, get out the door. And so we have manipulated, since we got that diagnosis, we manipulated our life to be compartmentalized and to be organized. And it's very difficult for 2 parents who also have ADHD and struggle to organize themselves. So putting those systems in place was super important. And little do we know that 18 months later, we would find out that my younger kid was struggling. And so putting those in place, I think, helped our whole family. And I think also in this moment of COVID, asking children with ADHD to sit in front of a computer for 8 hours is insane. And so how are we making accommodations for people who have such amazing skills and strengths? 33% of people with dyslexia are entrepreneurs, which means they forged their own way. They've figured it out on their own. And so I'm excited to see new learning models that do that.
I'm wondering, as you've had conversations with your sons, how do you talk about being neurodivergent and how their brains work differently?
It's a really interesting question. And it actually came up a lot with the women I interviewed as well, is that I've told them from an early age that their brain just works differently. And the fact that their father is such a passionate, entrepreneur who's such a sweet and giving man, they talk about how my brain works like poppies. And once they see that and they understand that in the context, they see it as a strength. There's a woman I interviewed in North Carolina whose child was devastated. And then when they found out the dad had it and he had it, he's like, oh, great, I'm going to be a successful businessman like my dad. And so I think there's this positive association. But let me tell you, every day we are fighting to read. Every day it is a struggle. And so they're starting to see the other side of it, especially my little one, and he sees his brother thriving. And so I guess that's the motivation they have. And technology is a real tool. And I think I'm so glad they have that. It wasn't there when we were growing up. I was gifted and I had those same struggles. And so, yeah, I think that can help them and encourage them.
Yeah. Well, final thoughts as we kind of wrap up.
Sure.
If you're talking to another parent who's maybe just beginning to travel this path or maybe is just exhausted from the path that they've been on for a while, what do you say to them? What advice do you give?
Go to groups of people who've been there before, because they're going to show you the shortcuts and the path on how to get there. Like I said, I learned more from the dyslexia advocate group than I learned from any other professional resource. Talk to an advocate if you're on that other side. I find they are super helpful and they're super accessible in this moment. Telehealth is sometimes an option if you want to get some tests or some pediatricians. Buy my book. It paints a path of what you should do. 1 in 5, how we're fighting for our dyslexic kids in a system that's failing them. And if you're questioning whether something's going on with your kids, some tasks I've said lately is like play hide and seek in the house. Have them write you a note of where it is. Look at how they're writing, can they hear you when they're hiding, right? How long do they hide for? There's just so many things you can tell from simple things. And these learning disabilities are sitting at our kitchen table. So look over your shoulder on a Zoom call, right? Talk to your neighbors about where your kids are reading at. And like I said, trust your motherly instinct. When you know something's up, there is, and don't be in denial like I was, and listen to smart people like Emily and get the diagnoses early and get on your way.
Micki, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Advocating for neurodivergent kids is difficult when the system is unfamiliar and complicated. Dyslexia and similar disabilities can be tricky because many dyslexic kids are bright and able to compensate for their difficulty with reading, so the fact that they need help goes unnoticed. When I worked as a school counselor and teacher, everyone I worked with wanted to provide the very best education for every student. And we were often frustrated and bound by policies and standards that didn't make sense. I saw parents who were confused by the educational jargon, and they often felt helpless when the school couldn't offer the assistance their child needed. One obvious takeaway from this conversation with Micki is that parents need to be unafraid of rocking the boat and asking for help. Maybe less obvious is that this applies to teachers too. As we learn more about the needs of neurodivergent kids and how many of their needs go unnoticed and unmet, we are in the position as educators to make the change happen from the inside. Whether it's tweaking the response to intervention plan within your building, pushing for policy change within your district, or advocating at the state level for more funding for our neurodiverse schools, together we can create change that benefits all our students. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Heads up, you can find links to 1 in 5 by Micki Boas, along with a link to the tutoring Marshall Plan Emily and Micki talked about on the episode 77 page of neurodiversitypodcast.com. Thanks to our Patreon patrons who financially support our efforts. It would be hard to imagine making it without your help. If you'd like to join them, go to patreon.com/neurodiversity. For Emily, this is Dave Morris, Emily's audio engineer and wine steward, and this podcast's executive producer. Stay safe. Stay healthy. See you next time. This podcast is a production of Morris Creative Services.